The sun was sinking low over the forest, casting long shadows across the snow. The sound of the sawmill had gone quiet for the day, its heavy blades resting after hours of cutting timber. Luke stood outside, wiping his hands on a rag, his breath fogging in the cold air. It was quiet here, the kind of quiet that made a man notice the smallest things: the creak of the trees, the crunch of snow underfoot, and the faint smell of pine drifting on the breeze. He had lived alone near the forest edge for years, his cabin and sawmill sitting just far enough from the nearest town that visitors were rare. He liked the peace. He liked the slow rhythm of work and rest. But that evening, the rhythm changed. It started with a strange sound, a faint crash, almost like someone stumbling through the snow. Luke froze, his head turning toward the tree line. It wasn't an animal. There was a weight to it, followed by a muffled cry that made his chest tighten. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and started walking toward the sound. The snow was deep, each step crunching under his boots. The air was sharp, biting at his face. As he moved deeper into the trees, he spotted something. No, someone, half buried, in the snow. A figure lay crumpled, their clothing torn and strange, their body trembling faintly. Luke's heart kicked in his chest. He hurried forward and knelt beside the figure. It was a woman, or at least she looked like one. Her skin had a faint silver tone, her hair a pale shimmer that caught the fading light. Her breathing was shallow, her lips pale from the cold. She tried to speak, but only a weak whisper came out, and he couldn't understand the words. "Easy," Luke said softly, though he didn't know if she understood him. "You're gonna be all right." He slid his arms beneath her and lifted her from the snow. She was lighter than he expected, but her body was tense, as if she'd been running for a long time. The cold had settled into her bones, and he could feel the slight tremor in her frame. The walk back to the cabin felt longer with her in his arms, though he moved as quickly as he could. By the time he reached the porch, his breath was coming in heavy clouds, and the last of the daylight had nearly vanished. Inside, the cabin was warm, the wood stove crackling softly. He set her gently on the small couch near the fire and pulled a thick blanket over her. She stirred faintly, her eyes opening just enough for him to see they weren't human. Her irises were a deep violet, almost glowing in the firelight. Luke knelt beside her, brushing snow from her hair. "Can you understand me?" he asked. She blinked, then gave the faintest nod. Her lips moved, and he leaned closer to catch the sound. "Alira," she whispered. The name was delicate, like it didn't belong in a place as rough as a sawmill cabin. "Alira," he repeated, giving a small nod. "I'm Luke. You're safe here." Her breathing steadied a little, though she still looked weak. He went to the small kitchen, poured some water into a cup, and returned. Supporting her head, he helped her drink. She swallowed slowly, as though every motion took effort. After a few moments, her eyes drifted to the fire, watching the flames with a strange expression. Luke followed her gaze, wondering what she saw. Did her world have fires like this? Had she ever sat in a quiet cabin before? He didn't ask. She looked too tired for questions. Instead, he stoked the fire higher, making sure the warmth reached her. He brought over another blanket and tucked it around her shoulders. The storm outside was picking up, the wind rattling against the windows. Luke knew that if he hadn't found her, she wouldn't have survived the night. That thought lingered in his mind, along with another he didn't want to admit: that there was something about her that drew him in. Her eyes closed again, and her breathing became softer, steadier. Luke sat back in his chair, watching her in the firelight. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, and he had no idea where she had come from or why she had been in the forest. But he knew one thing. He couldn't let her go back out there, not with the cold and the dark pressing in. For now, she was. Here, in his cabin, under his care. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet feeling began to grow. one he hadn't felt in years. The storm outside grew stronger through the night, the wind whistling through the gaps in the wooden walls. Luke sat by the fire, listening to it while keeping an eye on Alira. She had drifted into a deep sleep, her breathing now calm, her silver-toned skin catching the glow of the flames. Every so often she would shift slightly as though caught. In a dream. He leaned back in his chair, wondering about her story. She wasn't from any nearby settlement, and the few alien traders that came through the region never looked like her. She had the kind of presence that made the room feel different, as if her being there carried weight. After some time, she stirred and opened her eyes. Luke noticed her looking around, as if trying to understand the space she was in. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You're safe," he said gently. "No one's going to hurt you here." She blinked slowly, taking in his words. "Safe," she repeated, her voice soft and slightly accented. He nodded. "You were out cold in the snow. You're lucky I found you when I did." Her gaze dropped to the blanket wrapped around her. "Thank you," she said after a pause. Luke went to the stove and poured hot water into a small mug with dried herbs. He brought it to her and helped her sit up so she could sip it. She took it in both hands, holding it as if the warmth itself was something precious. For a moment they sat in silence. The crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside filled the air. Finally, Alira spoke again, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her drink. "I came here, not by choice," she said slowly. "My ship, it was attacked. I escaped. Crashed far from here." Luke frowned. "Attacked? By who?" She hesitated, as though weighing how much to tell him. "Hunters," she said finally. "They want something I know, something I carry." "And they're still after you?" he asked. She gave a small nod, her eyes meeting his for the first time in a long moment. "Yes. If they find me, they won't stop until I'm taken." There was no fear in her voice, but there was certainty. Luke felt something tighten in his chest. She was alone, far from her home, and someone out there wanted to harm her. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "then it's a good thing they don't know about this place. You can rest here for as long as you need." Alira looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It was part gratitude, part disbelief, and part something softer. "You would do that? For someone you just met?" "Someone I just met," he said. "Who would have died if I'd left her out there in the snow? I'm not the type to walk away from that." The faintest smile touched her lips. It was small, but it warmed the space between them more than the fire. Time passed slowly, the night deepening. Luke made them both a small meal from what he had: bread, dried meat, and roasted roots from his winter stores. Alira ate slowly, as if savoring every bite. She told him a little about her world, though she kept some details vague. She described oceans that glowed at night and forests where the leaves sang in the wind. Luke listened, picturing the places in his mind. "Sounds a lot different from here," he said. "Very different," she agreed. "But this place is quiet. It feels safe." When the fire burned low, Luke added more wood. The cabin filled again with the warm flicker of light. He could see her watching him, her violet eyes following the way he moved, the way he worked. He felt it too. An awareness between them, unspoken, but growing. Later, when she grew tired, he helped her settle more comfortably on the couch, adding another blanket. She hesitated before closing her eyes. "Luke," she said quietly, "thank you for not asking me to leave." He gave a small shrug. "You don't need to thank me. Just rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the world had narrowed to the glow of the fire and the soft sound of her breathing. Luke sat in his chair again, watching over her, his mind turning over everything she had said. There was danger out there, somewhere beyond the forest, and it was hunting her. He didn't know how close it was, but he knew one thing. If it came here, he wouldn't let it take her. As the hours passed, the quiet of the cabin wrapped around them both, and though neither spoke again before sleep took them, something had shifted between them. A fragile connection, born out of chance, now, taking root in the heart of a cold winter night. The morning came slowly, the storm outside easing into a soft snowfall. Pale light filtered through the small cabin windows, falling across the rough wooden floor. Luke stirred from his chair, his neck stiff from sleeping upright. The first thing he saw was Alira, still wrapped in the blankets on the couch, her breathing. "Steady!" He stood quietly, careful not to wake her, and went to the stove to start a pot of coffee. The smell filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of wood smoke. He was thinking about what she'd told him last night, about the hunters, the crash, and the danger following her, when he noticed something strange. There, just outside the window, faint tracks broke the fresh layer of snow. They weren't from a deer or a fox. The shape was wrong. Long, narrow footprints with pointed ends, almost like claws. Luke's jaw tightened. He glanced at Alira, still sleeping, then Grabby. His coat and stepped outside. The cold bit at his skin immediately, but he followed the tracks a few steps toward the edge of the clearing. They led in from the forest, stopping just a few meters from the cabin. Whoever, or whatever, had been here had turned back into the trees. He didn't like it. Returning inside, he found Alira sitting up, the blankets pooled around her. She looked more awake now, though there was still a weariness in her face. "You went outside," she said, softly. "Yeah," he replied, hanging up his coat. "Someone's been near the cabin. Saw tracks in the snow." Her expression changed immediately, the faint peace in her eyes replaced with sharp awareness. "Describe them." "Long, narrow. Claws at the tips," Luke said. She closed her eyes briefly. "They've found me." Luke didn't need to ask. Who? "How close will they get?" "Close enough," she said, her voice steady but low. "They don't rush. They watch first, learn the ground. Then they come at night." He felt a weight settle in his chest. She was speaking from experience, and the certainty in her tone told him she had faced this before. "Then we'll make sure they don't get what they came for," he said firmly. Through the rest of the morning, Luke worked around the cabin, with quiet purpose. He checked the rifle, laid a small hatchet by the door, and made sure the shutters were secure. Alira watched him for a while before quietly asking if she could help. "You should rest," he told her. "Resting won't stop them," she replied. He couldn't argue with that, so he handed her a small bundle of rope and asked her to help. Set simple alarms outside, old hunting tricks to warn them if something crossed into the clearing. They worked together in the cold, tying thin lines between trees and hanging small metal scraps that would clink if disturbed. Alira moved carefully, her steps light in the snow, and Luke noticed she was skilled at blending into the environment. Once they were back inside, he made them a meal, though neither ate much. The quiet between them now was different, tense, alert, as though both were listening for something beyond the sound of the wind. By late afternoon, the snowfall stopped, leaving the forest unnervingly still. Luke sat by the window, keeping an eye on the tree line, while Alira sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "You could still leave," she said suddenly. "They want me, not you." He turned to look at her. "And leave you here alone?" "Not happening." Her eyes softened, but she said nothing more. As darkness began to fall, Luke lit a lantern and set it near the window to cast light across the clearing. The forest beyond looked endless, the shadows deep and full of movement that might have been nothing, or might have been something waiting. Hours passed slowly. Then, just after midnight, a faint sound broke the silence. Metal clinked, softly in the cold air, one of the alarms they had set. Luke moved to the door, rifle in hand. Alira was already standing, her violet eyes sharp and fixed on the window. "Which side?" he whispered. "East," she replied without hesitation. He stepped outside, the cold air biting hard. The forest stood silent, but he could feel it. Something was out there, watching. Then he saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing between the trees. Its eyes reflected the lantern light, two faint glimmers in the dark. The shape didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching the cabin. Luke raised the rifle slightly but didn't fire. He wanted them to know they'd been seen. After a long moment, the figure turned and slipped back into the trees without a sound. When he stepped back inside, Alira was waiting. "They're testing us," she said quietly. "Then let them test," Luke replied. "They won't like the result." The night stretched on, the fire burning low, both of them knowing the real fight hadn't even begun yet. The next day brought no signs of the Watchers, but Luke knew they were still there. The snow outside was undisturbed except for a few faint marks near the far tree line, half buried under fresh flakes. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't natural, a stillness too perfect to be trusted. Luke spent the morning chopping wood, his breath fogging in the cold. Every swing of the axe was measured, his mind split between the task and the thought of the tall figure he had seen in the forest. He kept glancing toward the trees, expecting movement. Inside the cabin, Alira moved, carefully, her eyes often flicking to the windows. She seemed stronger than the night he found her, but there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't left since the tracks appeared. She knew the hunters better than anyone, and that knowledge weighed on her. By noon, they had reinforced the cabin. Luke dragged extra firewood inside so they wouldn't have to step out after dark. He hammered extra planks over the shutters and checked the rope alarms again. Alira suggested placing a few small mirrors outside to catch light and movement. A trick from her own world. "You've done this before," Luke said, handing her a nail. "More times than I wish," she replied. "The hunters, they don't stop. They don't rush, but once they've locked on, they follow until their target is taken." He didn't like the way she said taken. As the sun dipped lower, the cold deepened. They shared a simple meal and sat in the warm glow of the fire, speaking little. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken things. Then just after dusk, the first alarm rang, a sharp metallic clink from the west side of the cabin. Luke was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Alira moved to the far wall, her back against it, her eyes alert. Outside, the snow crunched faintly, slow steps circling. Luke stepped to the window and caught a shadow moving between the trees, tall, narrow, and silent. It wasn't alone. He could see at least two more shapes gliding through the darkness, keeping low. He stepped back from the window, meeting Alira's gaze. "3 of them," she nodded once. "There will be more." They spread out before closing in. The minutes stretched long. The sounds outside grew closer, snow shifting, branches cracking softly. Then, without warning, the eastern alarm went off. Another shadow moved through the clearing closer than before. Luke's hands tightened on the rifle. "They're surrounding us." "Yes," Alira said quietly. "Tonight they will try." The first real attempt came not with a knock or a shout, but with a sudden thud against the back wall of the cabin. The sound was heavy, deliberate. Luke spun toward it, the rifle ready. A moment later, something scraped along the wood, slow and dragging. Alira's voice was calm, but her eyes were locked on the wall. "They're testing for weaknesses." Luke wasn't about to let them think they'd found one. He stepped to the back door, flung it open, and leveled the rifle into the night. The sudden movement startled one of the hunters. He caught a glimpse of its pale, narrow face before it slipped into the shadows. He fired once into the snow, not to hit, but to send a message. The sound cracked through the forest, echoing between the trees. For a moment, the night went still again. When he stepped back inside, Alira was watching him closely. "You're not afraid," she said. "I am," he admitted. "But fear doesn't mean running." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Then we have a chance." For the next hour, the hunters didn't attack directly. Instead, they moved around the clearing, setting off different alarms, keeping the cabin's defenders on edge. Luke and Alira kept watch from opposite sides of the room, each scanning the dark for movement. Finally, just past midnight, the real push came. A shadow darted toward the front of the cabin, faster than the others. It reached the door and slammed against it hard enough to rattle the frame. Luke fired a shot into the wood, and the figure fell back into the snow, retreating. Another shape moved toward the back wall, but Alira was already there. She grabbed the hatchet from beside the stove, flung open the shutter, and sent the blade into the snow at its feet. The creature hissed, an awful, sharp sound, and vanished into the dark. After that, the forest went silent again. The hunters had tested the defenses and found no easy way in. Luke and Alira stood in the center of the cabin, breathing hard, listening for any sign they might return. When none came, Luke lowered his rifle but didn't put it away. "They'll be back," she said softly. "Then so will we," he replied. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows across the walls. They didn't speak again before dawn, but both knew the same truth. The hunters hadn't given up. They were only waiting for the next opportunity. The night's tension still clung to the air the next morning. The forest looked calm under a blanket of fresh snow, but Luke knew better. Danger often hid behind silence. He stepped outside to check the alarms they had set. Some had been disturbed. Faint clinks and bent ropes told him the hunters had been closer than he liked. Alira stood at the doorway, wrapped in a thick blanket. Her violet eyes scanned the tree line. "They're planning," she said softly. "Last night was not an attack. It was a study." Luke frowned. "Then they learned the cabin's defenses." "And they will try to break them," she replied. The day passed slowly. They worked together to reinforce weak points, moving heavy furniture against the doors, tightening ropes, and setting new alarms farther out in the clearing. Alira even showed Luke how to make a simple flare device from oil, cloth, and a small spark stone she carried. "Light can blind them for a moment," she explained. "It is enough time to strike, or to escape." He nodded, committing the trick to memory. As the sun set, the temperature dropped sharply. Luke added extra wood to the fire, but the warmth did little to ease the unease hanging between them. Both knew the hunters would not wait much longer. Just after dark, the first sign came, a single distant howl, low and drawn out, echoing through the trees. It wasn't an animal. Alira stiffened immediately. "They've called to each other," she said. "The hunt begins now." Luke loaded the rifle, checked the hatchet, and made sure the flares were ready. They took positions. He by the front. "Window, she near the back." The forest came alive with movement. Shadows darted between trees, too quick to count. The alarms began to ring one after another, metal clinking in the cold air. Then, a crash at the east wall. Luke spun and fired through. The shutter, hearing the shot, hit wood and splinter bark. A hiss followed, but the shadow moved away. At the same time, two more figures rushed the back of the cabin. Alira lit a flare and threw it into the snow, the sudden burst of light forcing them to recoil. Luke ran to her side, firing at another shape that tried to slip through the glow. They worked in sync without speaking. He covering her with the rifle, she using quick bursts of light to blind and disorient the hunters. But the attackers were relentless. One made it close to the front door, slamming against it hard enough to crack the outer frame. Luke grabbed the heavy table they had pushed aside earlier and shoved it against the door just as the wood began. "To splinter!" Alira called out from the back. "3 coming in from the west!" Luke dashed to the window, raising the rifle. He fired once, dropping one of the shapes into the snow. The other 2 vanished into the shadows, only to reappear at the far side of the clearing. The attacks came in waves, fast, fierce bursts, followed by eerie silence. Each time they thought the hunters might retreat, another push would come from a different direction. At one point, a shadow made it all the way to a side window. It began to pry at the shutter, long claws scraping wood. Alira swung the hatchet, with precision, the blade slamming into the frame just inches from the intruder's hand. The creature let out a sharp, inhuman cry and disappeared. The hours stretched on, both of them growing tired but refusing to let their guard drop. Finally, near dawn, the attack stopped. The forest fell still again, the only sound the slow crackle of the dying fire. Luke and Alira stood in the center of the cabin, breathing hard, listening. "They'll come again," Luke said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "But we hurt them tonight. They will be slower next time." He set the rifle aside and looked at her. "You fought well." Her expression softened, a flicker of warmth breaking through the tension. "And you fight like someone who's been hunted before." He gave a small shrug. "Maybe not by anything like this." They didn't speak for a while after that, each lost in thought. But as the first light touched the snow outside, Luke realized something had changed. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were fighting together, and that made them stronger than either had been alone. The day after the long night was strangely calm. No alarms went off, no shadows moved in the tree line. The snow lay untouched except for the marks left from the battle hours earlier. Luke stood outside in the cold morning air, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. It felt wrong, too quiet, too still. Inside, Alira prepared food, though her movements were slower than usual. Fatigue was setting in for both of them. She glanced toward the window where Luke stood, sensing his unease. "They are waiting," she said. "They watch for weakness. Tonight they will strike for real." Luke stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. "Then tonight we give them nothing. No weakness, no opening." The rest of the day was spent in preparation. Luke checked every weapon they had: the rifle, the hatchet, the flares. Alira crafted more of her spark-stone lights, each one wrapped in cloth and soaked in oil to burn longer. She also showed him a trick for making a quick blinding flash using snow and light, something from her own world survival training. As evening approached, they brought in all remaining supplies. The fire burned bright, casting warm light across the room. Outside, the forest began to darken, and the stillness became heavier. Just after nightfall, the first sign came, a low, rumbling sound that rolled through the trees. It wasn't a howl, like before. It was deeper, more deliberate. Alira froze where she stood, her hand tightening around the handle of the hatchet. "That is their signal," she whispered. "They are all here." Luke moved to the front window and peered out. Shapes began to form in the snow, taller than men, moving with fluid precision. There weren't 3 or 4 this time. There were at least 8 circling the clearing. The first attack came from the north, sudden and brutal. 3 hunters broke from the tree line, rushing toward the cabin with claws outstretched. Luke fired twice, dropping one and forcing the others back. From the west, another group closed in. Alira hurled a flare into the snow, the burst of light, cutting through the darkness. The attackers hissed and shielded their eyes, giving Luke time to fire again. But they didn't stop. More shapes darted in from the east, pounding against the shutters and doors. The wood groaned under the force. "Front door won't hold long," Luke called out. Alira moved quickly, grabbing a heavy beam they had set aside for this moment. Together they braced it against the door, just as a massive blow shook the cabin. The hunters began to use their numbers, attacking from multiple sides at once. One smashed a window frame, only to be met by Alira's hatchet, which struck the wooden sill just inches from its reaching claws. Another tried to force its way through the back, but Luke lit one of Alira's sparkstone flares and shoved it out, the blinding light forcing the creature to retreat. The air was filled with the sounds of claws on wood, the sharp cracks of the rifle, and the hiss of burning oil. The cabin shook under the assault, but every attempt to break in was met with fierce resistance. Minutes stretched into an hour. Luke's arms ached from firing, and Alira's breathing was heavy from constant movement. The heat from the fire, mixed with the cold wind that slipped through small cracks, making the air thick and tense. Then came the worst moment of the night. One of the hunters, larger than the rest, managed to wedge itself halfway through a shattered window near the back. Its clawed hand swiped dangerously close to Alira's face before she ducked and drove the hatchet down hard into the wooden frame beside it. Luke fired at point-blank range, and the creature fell back into the snow with a sharp, inhuman cry. The others hesitated after that. They circled, growling low, their glowing eyes fixed on the cabin. "They're thinking about it," Luke said, between breaths. "Then we end it before they decide," Alira replied. Together, they lit every remaining flare and tossed them out into the snow, filling the clearing with burning light. The hunters recoiled, shielding their eyes and backing toward the tree line. Luke fired one last warning shot into the ground, and finally, the figures began to fade into the forest, their growls echoing until they vanished completely. The silence that followed was almost unreal. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the faint hiss of the burning flares in the snow. Luke lowered his rifle, his muscles aching from the fight. Alira leaned against the wall, breathing hard but steady. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Both knew they had survived the worst night yet. But deep inside, Luke also knew this wasn't over. Not until they found a way to end the hunt for good. The morning after the attack was gray and cold, the sky heavy with low clouds. The clearing outside the cabin was littered with the marks of the night, burned patches where the flares had scorched the snow, claw marks on the wooden walls, and dark stains that told of wounded hunters. Luke stood at the doorway, staring at the tree line. The forest was silent again, but it was not the kind of silence that meant safety. Alira stepped beside him, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "They will come again," she said softly. "But after last night, they will not. Attack blindly. They will come with everything they have." Luke's grip tightened on the rifle. "Then we can't wait for them to come to us." Her eyes shifted to him, studying his face. "You mean to take the fight to them?" "Yes," he said. "If we stay here, we'll keep fighting until the cabin is gone. But if we end it now, we can have peace." There was a long pause, then Alira nodded. "I know where they are." "I can lead you." They spent the rest of the day preparing. Luke packed extra ammunition, the hatchet, and a length of rope. Alira gathered the last of her sparkstone flares and made a small pouch of fine powder that shimmered faintly in the light. "What's that?" Luke asked. "Hunter's dust," she explained. "On my world, it blinds their kind for a full minute, more than enough time to finish them." By late afternoon, they were ready. They moved into the forest as the light began to fade, following. The faint signs Alira pointed out. Broken branches, deep claw marks in the bark, and trails in the snow that no animal made. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. After nearly an hour of walking, they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking a hollow surrounded by trees. There, half hidden by shadows, was a crude shelter made of fallen logs and hides. "That is where they stay during the day," Alira whispered. "At night, they hunt." Luke crouched beside her, scanning the hollow. He could see movement, shapes shifting in the shadows. There were fewer than last night, maybe 5 or 6. "You ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said, simply. They moved like shadows themselves, circling down toward the hollow. Alira sprinkled the hunter's dust across the snow in a half-circle ahead of the shelter. Luke ready to flare in one hand, the rifle in the other. When they were close enough, Alira stepped forward and tossed a small stone into the hollow. The noise was enough to draw the hunters out, their glowing eyes snapping open in the dim light. The first one stepped into the dust and hissed in confusion, blinking rapidly. The others followed, and within seconds, all of them were stumbling, claws swiping at the air. Luke lit the flare, the burst of light turning the hollow into a blazing circle of fire and shadow. The hunters reeled, their cries sharp and pained. He fired once, then twice more, each shot dropping a shape into the snow. Alira moved with precision, using the hatchet when any got too close. Together they struck fast, giving the hunters no time to recover. The fight was over in minutes. The hollow fell silent except for the sound of their breathing. The snow was scattered with broken branches, scorch marks, and the still forms of their enemies. Luke lowered the rifle, scanning the trees for any sign of more. There was nothing. "It's done," Alira said quietly, her voice almost disbelieving. "It's done," Luke agreed. They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the past days settling over them. The danger that had shadowed them since the night she collapsed in the snow was gone. As they made their way back to the cabin, the forest seemed lighter, the air less heavy. By the time they stepped into the clearing, the first stars were appearing above. Inside, Luke set the rifle aside for the first time in days. Alira sat by the fire, her eyes reflecting the warm glow. He joined her, the quiet between them now, soft instead of tense. "You saved my life," she said. "We saved each other," he replied. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, slowly, she reached out, her hand resting on his. It was a small gesture, but it carried more than words could. In that touch was trust, gratitude, and something deeper. Something that had grown quietly between them in the hours of fear and the moments of shared strength. The fire crackled, the snow outside lay undisturbed, and for the first time since, they met. There was no danger pressing at the door. Only the soft hum of the night and the warmth of two people who had faced the dark together and found something worth holding on to.